Good afternoon, everybody. Happy Tuesday. It's been a while since we fired up one of these and got a little bit of opinion and perspective on all things Norwich City. So we thought, given that it's been a couple of days now, obviously, since Norwich City's relegation from the Premier League has been confirmed, the earliest point at any season in their history that they have been relegated. And of course, it's been a fairly dismal season generally. So kind of Southwell joined by Paddy, Davitt. Of course, we thought we'd jump on and get your thoughts, opinions. So obviously, whether you're watching this on Facebook, YouTube, or Twitter, you hopefully will be less rusty than we are, and you'll be able to know where to put your comments and opinions while we're with you for the next probably half an hour, 45 minutes or so. So, Pad, I mean, we obviously recorded a podcast on Sunday, which if you haven't listened to, go and listen to. We discuss a lot of topics and a lot of issues in depth, really, but we'd like to obviously throw the floor open to you guys and be dictated to whatever you want to talk about. But Pad, I mean, whilst we let people get kind of their questions and their thoughts in down below, and I can already see that we've got a few in there, which is good. 2 days on this relegation, I mean, where do you think that fans are with it? Is it anger? Is it apathy? Dare we use that word? Is it relief a little bit as well? Is it excitement for what's to come? How would you kind of assess the mood of everyone? Maybe they're better placed to tell us.
You've stood my thunder there, Connor. Yeah, I mean, I'm more interested to turn this around almost the camera and let's hear exactly where the mood is. For me, obviously not a Norwich fan, but being in and around it for quite a number of seasons now, probably it feels to me at least that all of those emotions you described, Connor. I mean, you are a Norwich fan as well as a media person who covers the football club, so you are probably better qualified than me in terms of what this feels like in the gut, as a Norwich fan, to be relegated again and the manner of it. But it does feel that, and we've said this on the podcast the other day, you're right, that it feels, I think, worse than 2 seasons ago. And we'll probably get into the nitty gritty of why it feels worse. But ultimately, I'm more intrigued where Norwich's fan base are at now. What are the, as we're trying to tee this up, what are the pressing issues now for you? Is it ownership? Is it the model? Is it the sporting director and all the sort of the off the field elements around him, around that Newcastle game? Or is it now, okay, forward with Dean Smith at the helm and what that looks like in terms of the squad and going into the summer? So, we maybe sometimes with our media hats on are probably guilty of just talking amongst ourselves, and it becomes a bit of an echo chamber, and we sort of opine about what Norwich fans think about the situation. But obviously today, hopefully, we'll get a clear sense of it. We'll throw the floor open, Connor.
Yes, absolutely, and we've already had some really decent comments. So I'll start with Jez Davis, who's broken his kind of thoughts into 3 comments. So I'll read through them. He's said, I thought I'd get in a message early on. There is a mass panic at the moment amongst fans and the media. I guess he includes us in that. When all honesty, we just have to relax. The current setup has got us out of the Championship before, and they'll get us out again. We have a good young squad, and with a few minor adjustments, I don't see any reason why we can't go out next season and achieve our goals. Players like Scholes, Sargent and Rashica will all benefit from a season in the Championship and will be stronger for it. Everyone chill out, enjoy your summers and come back refreshed, ready to go next season, which I guess Jez's points are probably not too dissimilar from how maybe Dean Smith felt about the situation post-match when he was asked about it at Villa Park. He feels it is going to be minor tweaks to this squad rather than the major surgery, given the last 2 campaigns in the Championship, for all that we kind of, at the moment, are reflecting on another Premier League relegation, the last 2 years at this level. Actually, to contrast it, where they're heading, they've been supremely successful in the last 2 years.
Yeah, and obviously I was there at Villa Park when he did his post-match, and it was really quite illuminating, actually, that because we've come back with, and we'll probably get into it again today, that, it's almost not for one moment taken for granted that they come back up again next season, but a lot of it is, yeah, but if they come back again next season, what's going to be different when they land back in the Premier League if it's still the same sporting director, the same model? But Dean Smith is quite clearly, by his comments after that game, because he was asked directly about that, the kind of almost, you've got back again, what happens to say it's different? He said, absolutely irrelevant until he can get a team and a squad together to get Norwich promoted. It was almost, from his point of view, part that I'm not interested in the what if 12 months down the line if something hypothetically pans out between now and then. So to bring that back to the point you make there about what he thinks about the squad overhaul, he doesn't. He thinks he has more than enough good players already in the building, because a lot of those have been on this journey. And at championship level, clearly two titles in 2 seasons at that level tells you they're good enough at that level. Added to that, of course, he will want to put his own stamp on it inevitably, because he was denied that opportunity in January, and there's no way he would go into a new season with the same players he'd inherited. So he will want to freshen it up. But the way he talked about Sam Byram again, the way he talked about Omobama Daly and Ida, these are players clearly he feels are more than good enough and can grow again. And they're not the only ones. So, yes, there'll be an inevitable turnover, and some of that will be on Norwich's terms. Some maybe won't be. Jez's point about Rashica, there was some Kosovan football social media I saw at the weekend sort of saying that he will move on. That's what I've heard anyway prior to that very much he is one, whether it's coming from the players aspect or maybe the club are looking at it in terms of an asset that they can, as they will need to do, generate funds to do what they want to do themselves. That is a scenario that could easily come to pass. So that doesn't surprise me. Max Aarons, you could put in that category as well. There might be one or two others. We have heard bits and pieces around Grant Hanley and Premier League clubs monitoring his situation. So there'll be so many moving parts. But fundamentally, if you were to bring Dean Smith into this chat right here, right now, he would say, yeah, it is tweaks. It is evolution rather than, sorry, guys, it isn't really about next season. It's about building for a Premier League squad and almost Premier League grade upgrades to what they've got now. No, for Dean Smith, it is very much day one in the Championship, having a team that is good enough to win games at that level consistently, to do what a Fulham have done, what Bournemouth may do, or Forest may have a say in that tonight, but to come back at the first attempt, as they did previously under Daniel Farke and Stuart Webber. So, yeah, I get the clear sense from Dean Smith that, yes, there will be changes, but not the wholesale ones.
Yeah, which is really interesting, I think, for 2 reasons. From his perspective, I guess he's looking at the task at hand, which ultimately is another season in the Championship, and he's probably realised that, certainly for the last month, but probably deep down, maybe even since he took the job, and was able to fully assess this group of Norwich City players. But equally, this conversation is not too dissimilar to the one we were having 2 years ago after Norwich City were relegated after Project Restart, and we heard from Stuart Webber, and it was all about building a squad capable to make sure that this time, when this did happen, when they did return to the Premier League, that it would be different. And ultimately now you look at a large portion of that squad, some of them have 2 relegations at this level from their CV. That's not luck. You can't put that down to a bad season. That suggests ultimately that group of players, and we could probably pin through a few who maybe we feel are good enough to stay at Premier League level if that situation occurred. But for the vast majority of them, it's very hard to make credible arguments as to why maybe they're good enough at this level. And that will be the fear that I'm sure some people have, is that even though Dean Smith might not be viewing it beyond next season, because ultimately he has to plan for a Championship promotion campaign, fans will be asking that question. And ultimately it's probably a pertinent question until Norwich City actually go and stay in the Premier League. But if he's not planning for an overhaul, that does feel a little bit at odds with what he said after the Newcastle defeat about there being a losing culture, because how do you change that culture without changing the people living that culture and existing within that culture?
Yeah, it's a great point. And I think, that was immediately after that Newcastle game where they were abject. For 20, 25 minutes, they had a go as soon as the first goal went in. The second followed 6 minutes later, I think. And then they conceded a calamitous one straight after half time. And they did effectively throw it in. Let's be honest about it. Anybody who was there, anybody who maybe watched from afar or listened from afar, that, and encapsulated by those Dean Smith post-match comments, where, as well as talking about the culture, the most telling aspect of what he said that day was, I turned to Craig Shakespeare's 86 minutes in. I'm looking at a team that I've had for 20-odd games, and they don't look angry. They don't look like this is hurting them. They're not picking up any yellow cards, as he sort of quantified it, but not because he wanted them going out, losing their heads and kicking people. It was just show the qualities and the attributes that you need to show, which is why, yeah, he did talk about a losing culture. But I think maybe, as the dust settled that day, he goes away, he thinks about it, and he probably understands the practicalities of it, that you simply can't say see you later to 20 players this summer, because ultimately what will he be judged by? It will be getting that team and that squad back to the Premier League at the first available opportunity. To do that, he knows he's going to need some of those guys who, as he says, they've been more than good enough, the ones who've been on the journey, to get out of the Championship, less so to stay there in the Premier League. And that jump up, he says, they've found difficult. Now, whether Dean Smith feels him and Shakespeare and Liam Bramley over the course of another 12 months or so can instill some of the qualities and the attributes you need in those players to ensure that if they did get back to the Premier League, it would be different. Who knows? But I think probably how he spoke about the culture and really going for almost a major turnover, at least signalling that's where his head was at after the Newcastle game. I think we probably have to filter out maybe some of the emotion, some of the frustration he clearly felt that afternoon, and then look at the practicalities of where Norwich need to be come the start of next season is not trying to bed in numerous different players, because that's going to be very hard to accomplish that while hitting the ground running and winning games. And of course, there is one major difference between when they kick off again next season in the Championship compared to the 2 seasons ago. Fans will be in the stadia unless something drastically changes in terms of the environment that we're living in at the moment. And if they were not to get off to a winning start, and we can sense the mood of frustration is palpable there, what would be the mood music around the group then? So I think it's absolutely imperative that come the start of next season, Dean Smith has a group that are ready to go, not a group who he has to basically say, look, it might take us a few months to get up to speed. I don't think they'll be afforded that time, personally.
No, I would agree. And there's going to be some natural churn anyway, because you've got loan players going back. The 2 players that you've mentioned, Milo Rashica and Max Aarons, possibly throw Grant Hanley into that mix as well. There is going to be a natural churn to the squad, irrespective of what happens. So I suppose his suggestion will be he feels that he can maybe add some frontline options that can help change that culture in the long term. And I suppose that the key is now that he's afforded some time to do that. I mean, we've had lots of really, really interesting questions in already, but I mean, we're talking about Dean Smith, so we may as well stay on him. There was one comment in particular I wanted to pull up from Chris Ellis, who said, are you worried like me that Smith couldn't get the current squad to perform since he's been here, but he will predominantly have the same nucleus to mount a comeback challenge? What will change? And I guess that kind of lends into the point that we've spoken about, but there was a bit of analysis on Match of the Day. I think it was Danny Murphy who did it, and was speaking about Norwich City's lack of playing identity and maybe questioning what they were trying to do at this level. I mean, ultimately, it is difficult to disassociate Smith with this season, because he's been in charge for more games than Daniel Farker was, but equally Norwich haven't signed a single player. So I guess there probably is, to a degree, cutting him a little bit of slack, but he will be under no illusions. He's been around the block long enough to know what he will need to do to change not just the quality of this squad and the output of this squad, but also the mentality of this squad as well.
Absolutely. I mean, he said, whether you agree or disagree, but after that game Saturday, he said progress has been made, but not fast enough. And he said before the game, in terms of the culture of their willingness to sort of take what him and Shakespeare were trying to impart at Colney, he said he couldn't fault it, the attitude, the work ethic. But then he also added, but we've had to revisit too many topics for my liking. So, it tells you that, he will have tried to instill principles and get his views across. And clearly it hasn't happened in the timescale he would have hoped for, and certainly in the timescale to make Norwich even competitive, let alone, actually finishing 17th or above. So, yeah, that is a fair question. But I just think, while he accepted his fair share of responsibility, as he should do, I think he's had 21, 22 games. And even though it was a group of players he inherited, I think we'd have expected more visible signs of progress. There was pockets of it, but as he has routinely said, you kind of get to that Christmas period and through the COVID-related issues and the injury-related issues, you're losing your key players, your Timu Pukis, your Tim Krul's, Grant Hanley. They're just, as he said, nowhere near good enough in terms of what they had underneath those guys to continue to get results. And, rightly or wrongly, I think that is factual. Those games against Palace and Villa and Arsenal, really, it was just patched up and putting players on the pitch who weren't good enough for that level and the jobs he was asking them to do. But ultimately, he did have plenty of other games the other side of Christmas, and there were signs of it. To give him his due, I think back to the Everton Watford swing, genuine signs, and of course then Adam Eder, who was pivotal to those two games, certainly the Everton game. He gets injured, he's out for the season. These are all cards that Dean Smith had no control over, but ultimately, I'm sure every coach and every team in the land would have had to deal with similar levels of adversity at some point during the season. So there is mitigation, but ultimately he deserves to be judged on what they didn't produce over these 21-22 games, and it hasn't been good enough. And now, as I say, I don't think he will get, in terms of the mood you sense from the fan base, I don't think it will get 14th in October next season in the Championship, and this is a work in progress. No, I think it needs to be swift, and it needs to happen very fast at the start of next season. Otherwise, all those issues around Dean Smith specifically, about this identity and what's he trying to do, what are Norwich under Dean Smith with the ball, all of those will only grow, and he won't be able to turn around and say, well, these are the players that I've inherited, because he will have had a transfer window to put his imprint on it, as he said he wanted to do. But if you took the Newcastle one out of the equation, for me there was signs of an identity. There was signs of what they're trying to do. With Kieran Dowell and Pierre-Lise Malou in a 4-2-3-1, if we want to call it that. Yes, they lost at United, but you could see what they were trying to do with the ball. And obviously the Burnley game prior to. And maybe even against Villa, although I still think, Villa were very much, felt like, going through the motions, and the intensity and the tempo wasn't really there. But there was still elements of Norwich on the ball that you could see, a pattern of what possibly it looks like under Dean Smith. But, is these crumbs enough? I don't know. I'm sure there'll be plenty of fans who still have, the jury is out in terms of Dean Smith and what he can actually bring to this group in terms of, a playing style and an identity. But ultimately, he is going to be able to try and now do this at a lower level where, for reasons already stated, he has a group of players who are proven at this level, certainly a nucleus of players. So it's going to be a lot easier for him to impart a culture, an identity, a style of play that is clearly defined in the less pressurised environment of the Championship, ultimately.
Yeah, and it's also much easier to impose a philosophy on a squad when you've got a better group of players relative to the division. Obviously, this season, if you're setting up Norwich to go and score goals, I think the evidence in terms of the league table, in terms of the goals scored, would tell you that that's not a particularly wise choice. I think what we're probably seeing is a little bit of pragmatism and a little bit of firefighting at the moment. But obviously, I think, like other people, there are elements for me that you'd still like to see Norwich have taken bigger strides forward in terms of what a Dean Smith side looks like. But I was encouraged by what they did at Manchester United and the Burnley game before that. There was, I felt, tangible signs of what he wanted to do. And again, this kind of lends into James's question, which again is on Dean Smith, and then we'll probably move on to maybe other protagonists in this relegation. James says there's been a bit of talk this season of Norwich lacking a clear identity. And I think it's worth pointing, before I read the rest of the comment, that was the case under Daniel Farke as well for points. There was a game in particular against Leeds where Norwich completely ditched the kind of football that he wanted to play. And that was after that game where the decision really was made to part company with him. So there's that element to it. But James has gone on to say, is it important that Dean Smith looks at that in the summer coming up? Or is it just a case of getting back to the Premier League and worrying about an identity later? I mean, the second part of the question I think is interesting because it's one that we've not really spoken about. But certainly the way that Stuart Webber operates, we know he's very process driven. He wants to see a team playing football in a certain way, hence why he appointed Daniel Farke. I think many people felt that Dean Smith was perhaps a step away from that kind of view. So just in terms of that second base of that question from James, Pad, is an identity important if Norwich City get back to the Premier League, irrespective of how they do it?
I think so. I think it is. And, I'm less concerned about what is Dean Smith about in terms of his style of play, because my mind always goes back to the Brentford side he had with Alex Pritchard in that kind of 10 role. And, those Villa teams were very pleasing on the eye with, love him or loathe him, Jack Grealish and, McGinn in the last couple of seasons. You had the threat at the top end of the pitch with Tammy Abraham. They were good attacking, progressive sides. Maybe not as ideologically driven as a Daniel Farke Norwich team in terms of it was almost Russell Martin-esque, the weight of passes they would accumulate, but obviously with the added punch of a Buendia and a Pukki to finish off some really, really beautiful football, let's be honest, that we were treated to under Daniel in the best moments of his period at Norwich. But of course, there has to be a pragmatism because it will boil down to winning enough games to either finish in the top two or come back up through the playoffs, as he did, Dean Smith, with Aston Villa. But I think underpinning a quest for results is if you have a clear style and a philosophy and your players understand what you're asking them to do and that they're comfortable in their roles that they're being placed on the pitch. All of those should be, for me, fairly mutually exclusive, rather than you can't have an identity if you're going to try and be pragmatic and win games of football. I think you have to do both, and fundamentally that, I think, aids their cause if they do come back to the Premier League. The thing that was always placed at Daniel Farke's door, whether maybe he was too ideologically driven, and that when he got to the Premier League, certainly the first time around, but even the 10, 11 games he had this season, that he was very wedded to, no, these are my beliefs, this is how we're going to play, this is how we're going to set up. And ultimately, if you want to play a style that a lot more teams in the Premier League can play a lot better than you, then more often than not, you come off second best. And I think with Daniel, there was always an accusation that, well, he's not pragmatic enough, that you need to dial down maybe the sort of these are my philosophical beliefs and I'm going to stick to them rigidly. And I'm pretty sure Dean Smith is the type of character. He's been around the block. He knows what it's all about. That you would see that. You would see a slightly more pragmatic edge to his type of football. But nonetheless, still for me, based on what we saw at Brentford and Aston Villa more recently, a very attractive attacking brand of football that I'm sure if it was coupled with a team who could actually win games of football, I'm pretty sure Norwich fans would be very happy to see a Dean Smith side in that image.
Do you think they need to be more pragmatic then? Because, I mean, last time they came down, we had this kind of Daniel Farke moment where he spoke about teams in the Championship who are more defensively solid having a better base to stay up the following season. I've actually got a statistic that I've just pulled in front of me, which is the team promoted with the lowest expected goals against in the Championship in the last 5 seasons have all gone on to stay up in the Premier League the following season. So that does kind of chime with what Daniel Farke says. So actually, for all this talk of identity and progressive football, is it more important that Norwich City are a lot tighter at the back next season if they have aspirations of then coming back to the Premier League and keeping themselves up in the division?
Absolutely. And to be fair, yeah, Daniel did know that. And who did they find in the Championship? A certain player called Ollie Skipp, who alongside Lucas Rupp maybe to start with, but then as that season developed, Kenny McLean did provide that ballast and that protection in front of a back four. Alas, as we all know, Ollie Skipp was too good for Norwich for this coming season, certainly in Tottenham's view, and they wasn't able to, which might segue into the recruitment element, which we always feel we get back to when we're digging down into what's gone wrong. But there was no suitable replacement of the level of Ollie Skipp, but also with maybe the attributes that he could bring to that group. So I think Daniel had acknowledged that and recognised that, but clearly they went into this season with Billy Gilmore and Matthias Norman wholly unprepared for that element of we need to be pretty much defensively strong. I mean, my mind goes back to some of those early Premier League games, and Liverpool, Manchester City, we know Norwich could have played out of their skins, still got beat. But I think back to even the Leicester game down at Carrow Road in that first month or so, and the way Leicester attacked and poured forward, and you've got Billy Gilmore trying to hold back the tide as Vardy and Maddison and Harvey Barnes and Iheanacho, these type of players. It was just, they were so open, so porous, and structurally so lacking in what was required to do that, to be resolute and maybe go from a defensive base. And as I say, that was something I think Daniel had recognised, but clearly, whether it was on his watch or Stuart Webber's watch or a combination of both, they didn't have the players really to execute that more robust defensive outlook. And a minus 49 goal difference, as much as, you could also look at the top end of the pitch, but that is a pretty damning statistic.
Yes, it definitely is. So we've kind of spoken about Dean Smith and a little bit of the on-pitch stuff. Like you say, I think inevitably we're probably going to end up coming back to recruitment, and I can see there's a lot of points about recruitment from those watching. So I think we'll probably embed that in rather than dedicating a specific pillar to it. But that probably lends us nicely onto Stuart Webber, who has taken a lot of flack, in particular for the.
Why do we need to talk about him, Connor? What's happened around him of late?
Yes, all very quiet around him.
Yeah,
isn't it? But this is, and I guess this is the fundamental point, one that Will Grant has made on YouTube, who says, I'm still annoyed about relegation. That's kind of the emotion that he's putting on it, annoyance. How can you build and create a new culture when your figurehead in Webber doesn't want to be here? He's put in brackets how it comes across, worrying. I think a lot of people share that kind of view about Stuart Webber, Pad, and maybe after that interview that he gave to a national newspaper, the fact he's climbing Everest as well. We obviously had the confrontation outside Carrow Road last weekend. I mean, all of this doesn't necessarily, even if it doesn't paint the picture that he does or doesn't want to be here, it paints the picture of a toxicity around the football club when things are bad and when you're getting relegated that probably already exist and don't really need to be added upon by a very senior figure on the sporting side of the organisation.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think in a quieter moment of reflection, he may admit that the timing of certainly that interview on the eve of the Newcastle game, the tone of it, were pretty ill advised. But it's happened now and it's out there. I mean, ultimately, for me, I think we said this on the podcast at the weekend. I think the next public utterances from that man will I think, be the most important since he took over the role in 2017, because he now needs to provide clarity on his own future. Those reports about that rolling deal hasn't been signed yet. They're accurate as they stood at the weekend, we understand. And, is that just something that he will get round to between now and June, or is there a bigger issue in play? So he needs to come out and be very, I think, unequivocal about that in his own future, because that will then send a signal. If he says, no, I'm adamant, I want to be part of this, I want to be part of the fight back, second time around on his watch, successfully completed the first time, let's be honest, to give him his due on that one. But at least then we'd all be in no doubt whatsoever that, yeah, he's on board. And then it moves on to, okay, particularly the first immediate thing is the recruitment, is to get that right far better than they did 12 months ago now, to equip Dean Smith with the ammunition to labour that point that he came out with about guns and tanks and what have you previously, to make Norwich, far better equipped to come back out of the Championship and then stay out of the Championship. So, yeah, I don't think that's an exaggeration. We understand he will front up at some point. Now relegation has been confirmed, and all those question marks around him personally, around what's gone wrong this season, and around what happens next will have to be answered. And there's a lot of bridge building I think needs to take place now, fundamentally, because rightly or wrongly, the question and the way it was framed, that's the perception that's coming back. We don't know how widespread that perception is, whether that's a seam of Norwich support, whether that's more broadly held, that maybe he's, is he fully focused now on it because he's got these other elements he wants to go and do with his life. The only way that gets answered is what he says, and then maybe more importantly, what he does over these intervening months between now and the start of the new season. So, I think that is not overstating the point to say that his next public utterances will probably be his most important at Norwich City.
Yes, absolutely. And I think it's interesting because I think when people are talking about, when you've got a head coach talking about losing cultures, I mean, that is quite damning on the dressing room, but it also feels a little bit damning on the person that's meant to set the culture, which is the sporting director, whether inadvertently or not, I suppose. And maybe Dean Smith would argue that he is setting the culture within the dressing room, who knows? But it just all feels, as we said, I think maybe in the podcast that we did after Newcastle, all a little bit end of era. And I kind of asked you the question in the podcast about how he goes and shifts the narrative now. A word's going to be enough, because it feels like Webber's words have rubbed people up the wrong way throughout his tenure as Norwich City sporting director. The difference is that what he said has actually come to pass. And actually, you take maybe what he said last summer about guns and bazookas and tanks. This is the moment where it hasn't come to pass. Did it always feel like when his words didn't match up with maybe what Norwich City did on the pitch, and the next step wasn't taken as he maybe said it was. And 2 years ago, he did say that it was like like climbing Everest, which feels a little bit ironic now. But he also said that relegation was prepared for and maybe even expected, given the lack of finance they put into it. This time he didn't say that. The message was different. And this is probably the first real time throughout his Norwich City tenure that we've seen him say something and it hasn't come off in reality. So is that just the case of why maybe his words are rubbing people up the wrong way, do you think?
Well, probably, yeah. But as we've said, I mean, for me, it wasn't maybe how he said it, because that is every interview I've ever conducted with him or I've seen him conduct since he walked through the door. That is him. That's very much. And to be honest, it certainly in the fertile periods, or maybe at the start when he inherited a bit of a shell of a squad and a financially precarious position, that bullishness that we're not little old Norwich, we'll stand our ground and we're going to get ahead of the curve and we're going to be innovative in so many areas, not just about the squad but the cultures, the training ground transformation, all of that. To have a guy fronting that up basically, and being such a marked departure maybe from what we'd heard before from people in similar positions to him at the football club, that was refreshing. At least that was my take on it. But you need to grow, you need to evolve as well, and that maybe applies to the messaging and picking the right words at the right time, and that isn't, I don't feel, not being true to yourself. It's maybe just dialing it down a touch and understanding that certainly right now at this stage, as it was pre-Newcastle, kind of what looked an inevitable repeat of what happened 2 seasons ago. Understanding that your fan base are going to be at a bit of a loss to why are we back here again when they'd spent for Norwich and the model substantial funds, not substantial by probably the majority of the Premier League, but certainly by Norwich's. And materially, you look at it now, I know there's 4 games left, they're on the same points total as they were 2 seasons ago, which was an abject failure. At least it was painted as that and portrayed as that. So, as I say, I don't want to labour the point, but until he tells us this is what went wrong with the recruitment, in my opinion, this is where we fundamentally got it wrong, and it's the actual intangibles of we went for either these players, we didn't get them, or the finances were such that we couldn't go after these, or we were even to the point of we were looking for that type of player in that type of position and we didn't get it. Until there's actually something else that you can hang on other than they spent X, look at the players they got, and that's why they were so uncompetitive as it stands now, looking at the league table. Then I think it's very hard to move the dial on, and it isn't for me just about Stuart Webber coming out and saying, yeah, well, I regret what I said in that interview or whatever. I don't think necessarily Norwich fans are particularly really fussed about hearing that, or even maybe on a broader point about him wanting to go off and do other things. I think what they want to hear is, we know it's gone wrong. Why did it go wrong? Why, as the person who was ultimately making a lot of those calls, why do you think it's gone wrong? And then how do we put it right? That's ultimately, I think, what we need to hear from the sporting director now, fundamentally. Rather than, I'm committed or I'm not committed, or my percentage of time is this or whatever. I think all of that is wide of the mark. It is, you presided over that recruitment. Do you think it was right? If not, what went wrong? Now we can palpably see those players were not fit for purpose. How has that come to pass? And more to the point, going into another season and another summer's recruitment, how do you avoid the same pitfalls again? Because if you don't, then how's it going to be any different? Yes, even with a patchy recruitment this summer, there is enough in the building already, and a very astute coach who's been over the terrain before to probably get them out of the Championship. But then 12 months on from now, they're back in the Premier League. They're at the start of another summer of massively important recruitment. How is it going to be any different again if the same person is presiding over it? So for me, yeah, that I think, if I'm a Norwich fan, I want to hear that. I want to hear, why do you think the recruitment was so not fit for purpose, and what were the reasons? Was there any mitigation? Were there things that we don't know about that have not been put out there? Let's hear them, because that's the only way I think you get past what is at the minute quite a searing focus on the errors in recruitment last summer, and he's ultimately the man who carries the can for that.
Yeah, we'll move on to some questions in a moment and some comments. But in terms of him, I mean, is there a point around commitment that people need to hear as well? I know that, as you said, a lot of that 90% quote, and we both agree on this point that it was taken out of context. I think Dean Smith probably summed it up nicely. Whether he should be answering questions about it or not, he ultimately did, and it was 90% of time rather than effort. But it's that perception, isn't it? The perception of someone who's coming out and saying in 3 years I'm going to leave. In that Times interview, there was even the line at the bottom: who knows, in 2 years' time, maybe I'll have a career change. It all feeds into a perception of someone who is thinking beyond Norwich City and beyond this project, which maybe is human instinct. Maybe it's a brutal honesty that everyone has in the game, but it's not necessarily what fans want to hear. And that's important when we're talking about repairing these fractures that maybe have emerged between fans and people at the top of the club, and apathy that, again, Dean Smith would argue doesn't exist. I think certainly from what I've heard from fans does exist. It does feel like there's maybe a need for him to come out and show a little bit of commitment to Norwich City. Do you think that's fair when people maybe say that as well?
Well, ultimately, yes, because I mean he's always maintained, to be fair to him, in terms of his own contract status, whether it was, when he'd signed that initial deal in 2017 and then him and Daniel signed on again for a fixed period of time. We all recall it. I think he said at that point, this is the last contract I will have with Norwich. I will go at the end of this, which is obviously as it runs out in a month or so's time. But clearly in an intervening period that the world has been turned upside down, and understandable that, things have changed, and maybe, again, he always talked about, I'd love to go abroad and do what I'm doing now for an overseas club. And, not only the pandemic, but the whole Brexit element of that. So things change. Ultimately, we all understand that. We all get buffeted by events as we move through life, whatever we do for a living or in our personal lives. But right here, right now, I think it is imperative for him to not say, well, my contract is irrelevant, really. It doesn't matter to me. Nobody internally is talking about that. As he's said in the past, people are very much externally talking about that. And ultimately, he needs to address that, because if he doesn't, and it's, well, is he going to be here at the end of the summer? Is he going to be here at the start of next season? Is he going to be here 12 months on from now? I think there needs to be some signal externally. I mean, he may well have, sat down with Dean Smith. As Dean Smith said at the time of when he was appointed, he wanted assurances from Stuart Webber that he would be here at the end of this season, moving into the next season. He clearly got those assurances because he's taken the post. So even if internally Stuart Webber is giving those assurances to the key people he's working alongside, I think probably the time has come that the fan base need to hear that as well. Because at the minute, rightly or wrongly, the perception around all of these, I want to go and do something else with my life, and alongside being still in charge of what I'm in charge of at Norwich, the perception is that, well, is it still all consuming as it was when he first walked through the door at Norwich? Is it, every hour of every day devoted to improving Norwich any which way he can? Which probably wasn't the case way back in 2017, but that was, again, the perception. It felt like that this was such a driven individual who wouldn't rest until, he'd transformed almost Norwich City as a football club on and off the pitch. And in many areas, you can't dispute he has done that. But right here, right now, it isn't about building new swimming pools or whatever at Colney this coming summer, or the soccer bot last summer. For a lot of fans, it's the 11 people who go out on the park on a Saturday, kicking a ball in the green and yellow, and actually giving them something to feel that they can compete at the level they were at this season, which was the Premier League. And singularly, the league table doesn't lie. They wasn't able to do that. So it's right that the focus is on the pitch and the recruitment. But, equally, he is right to stand his ground and defend his record overall in terms of the impact he's had on Norwich. He's transformed many areas of the football club. But right here, right now, we're talking about a team failing on the pitch. And that, ultimately, you trace the line of command back to him. And he has to take responsibility for that.
Yeah, and clearly from some of the comments I flashed there, that the feeling from some fans is that his time is up and this is an end of an era, and he does need to either leave post or be removed from post. And this is, again, as I said on the podcast, not ultimately for me and you to judge or to call for, because that's just simply wouldn't be right in the roles that we're in. It's ultimately up to the fans to express how they feel, and up to the board whether they choose to listen to the fans or not. But all of this, I mean, you look at past times when Norwich City have been relegated, last time in particular, but maybe beyond that as well. It's always been about trying to ensure they can be as stable as possible and going down with stability, whether that be keeping the head coach and the sporting director that got them relegated, whether it be keeping a lot of the individuals that are involved in the team that got them relegated, whether it's the owners that preside over that club as a whole. All of it felt very stable. Doesn't this time feel as though there is that same stability, that same belief that actually it's all right because next time it will be different? And I think fans, that's beginning to wear a little bit thin on fans to a degree. And plus, I think there's a lot of fans who would argue it doesn't really feel like that stability and that connection does exist. Even though there was anger and disappointment about the way they got relegated 2 years ago, there was still maybe an acceptance once Stuart Webber came out and said, actually, financially, we couldn't compete. We had to build a new training ground. We had to do the money for this, and this. But actually, this time that wasn't the reasoning or the comments that people were hearing. The rhetoric was increased and dialed up towards a survival. So I guess my question really is, how damaging could that lack of stability be this time? Do you agree with the lack of stability point? And then I suppose finally, how important is it for the people in positions of power, be it Stuart Webber, be it Dean Smith, be it the owners, the majority shareholders, to ensure that gets turned around pretty quickly and that Norwich are very quickly viewed as the stable club that they have been externally and internally in the past?
I think it's imperative and exponentially so for me in a model like Norwich's, which is self-sufficiency and incrementally trying to move forward compared to what looks increasingly like one of the other teams is going to drop out, which is Watford. Look at the turnover. It's the revolving door coming off its hinges at Vicarage Road in terms of their turnover of head coaches. But then if you think about it, I think the ownership has stayed the same there. That's still the Pozzo family, isn't it, if I'm not mistaken? So, but equally, you put those two models, which do seem to jar against each other. But in terms of Premier League membership, Watford have sort of bounced around probably as much as Norwich. I'd have to go and check in terms of exactly how many seasons in the Champo and the Premier League of the last 10 years, but I think it'd be a fairly similar split between the two clubs. So, maybe stability is overrated in some respects, but I do think in Norwich's model, as Dean Smith said, while defending the model there about a month ago, it lessens financially and purely in player trading terms the ability to get things wrong. You have to get more right than wrong because you're dealing with a very finite pot of resource in terms of finances. And I mean, it is worth stressing that the feeling inside the club, certainly around the turn of the year, was that going into this summer now, they'll be in the best financial situation in terms of stability than they probably have since Stuart Webber took over. So, yeah, I take your point about stability and maybe his status as the figurehead, and there needs to be some clarity around that. But then in other areas, as I say, financially, they probably are in a good, healthy, stable position, armed with parachute money. I don't think Watford / Everton Leeds aside, there'll be any player that they would go for with the remainder of the Championship next season this summer that Norwich wouldn't be able to outbid and then offer better terms to the player as well. So in terms of muscle financially, going for players this summer, Championship grade players, if they're in a fight with a Championship club, I think there'll only be one winner. So, there is a stability in facets of where Norwich are now as a club, but it doesn't feel like that at the minute. It doesn't feel like that. It feels like the wheels have come off again, and it's going to take, as I say, some searing honesty from Webber primarily to feel that this isn't a rudderless ship, and that there is a direction of travel which can very swiftly be put back on the track. I'm mixing the metaphors here. I'm going from ships to trains to whatever, cars, or a walking horse-drawn carriage. But essentially that, maybe them trying to tell us or through us the support that, no, take a step back. We're inside the camp. We know that there's a stability here. It may not visibly look like that at the minute because there's so many things it feels that are wrong around that football club. But trust us that, very swiftly as they get into the summer and then the start of next season, you will see that there is a stability and a sense that inside the club they're all on the same page and they're all heading in the right direction. But as I say, words and actions are what we need to see between now and the start of the season.
Yes, absolutely. A few more comments then. Carl Waits asked about the match today. And we did have a chat about that earlier, Carl, which I think when we come off here, you'll be able to watch the broadcast in full on whatever channel you're watching, Facebook, I think. So you'll be able to go back to that one. He's then added poor recruitment is the reason why we got relegated. Smith had to try and get something out of Farke's squad without adding to it in the January transfer window. Phoebe has said, for me, I don't care that he's got his own hobbies outside of his job, but what I do care about is where the club are heading. The whole atmosphere between the board and the fans is so toxic and will only get worse. I guess the point for me is I'm interested next season, obviously, hopefully this is the case, when Norwich start winning games in the Championship. I say start if, I suppose maybe is better. Will the fans then take to it in the same way? Will there be the same togetherness that we always hear banded about when Norwich City are going for promotions at the top end of the Championship? So that's, I think, probably the next phase of it that I'm interested to see, maybe how people respond to that if that's the case. Ben Allen has said, everyone keeps smiling, 100 goals and 100 points incoming. Never mind the danger. I love the optimism, Ben. And then James is concerned for you, Paddy. He's just asked, is your hand okay? I think you've got a plaster on, haven't you? So
that's very observant, mate. Yeah. I did. No, I won't go into that story. It's to do with a broken step outside my house and stepping off it the wrong way and going over. I actually ripped my trousers. I'm more distraught about a ripped pair of trousers than my hand. No, we'll be okay. Don't worry. If it was the fingers, then we might struggle. I don't know how I'd be able to type, but some would say that's probably not the worst scenario. But yeah, no, we're all good. Thank you. Thanks for asking.
Good stuff. Cool. Well, I think we're probably going to leave it there. Like I said, we've got another podcast which is available now. If you haven't listened to it, you can get that on all your kind of podcast providers that you choose to listen to. I think we've already had quite an incredible amount of listens for that in a fairly short period of time. So thank you very much. And of course, I am going to use this opportunity to advertise the app. If you're not yet on the Pink and Plus app or have subscribed to the app or taken a month's trial out, now is the time to do it. We've got plenty of content on there in the weeks and days ahead, even though Norwich City's fate has been secured. Paddy, would you like to confirm or deny?
Hold on. That's water. That's all I drink. H2O. Thank you.
There you go. Hydration is very key. I guess, Paddy, just to end, it's probably important to maybe clarify where we are with Stuart Webber at the moment. I think there's been some comments and stuff made on social media about maybe whether we'll be there at all when that interview does take place. So I guess I'll maybe throw it over to you to clear up, because I think we're obviously expecting a Webber interview at some stage, but for reasons that maybe you'll outline, it doesn't necessarily look like we'll be at the table of people potentially asking those questions.
No, that doesn't look to be the case. But very simply, there was an Evening News front page. I'm sure people will have seen maybe the JPEG of it flying around on social media early part of last week, following on from the sort of Newcastle incidents. Sporting director saw that front page, not happy, and as we sit here at the minute, will not be engaging with our organisation. So if that remains the case, then that's his personal choice. But ultimately, it won't impact on our coverage. I can assure anybody of that. We'll be there as we are week in, week out. When the Championship comes around and all those fly-by-nights who latch on for the Premier League depart, we'll still be there. So but fundamentally, that's where it is. It's as simple as that. Stuart Webber, as it stands, no longer wishes to deal directly with our organisation. So we'll deal with that as best we can. But fundamentally, all I would say is that we only exist to try and offer a channel of communication to the fan base. That's really our sole purpose here. We're not here for any other reason than to try and allow clubs and individuals within clubs to communicate with their fan base. And we're a very well-established brand, and we have quite a deep reach across Norfolk and further afield. So it's probably not in either party's interests for this to persist. But there you are. That's so the state of affairs, Connor, is if Stuart Webber stays true to that course of action, then we won't be sitting across the table. But we'll certainly be covering it in some way, shape, or form, I'm sure.
Yes, and nor does it stop us asking the questions that matter, or having the debates that matter, as we have done so today. So, we rest assured that none of that will change. And as you say, irrespective of whether it's Manchester United at Old Trafford on a Saturday or Preston away on a Tuesday night, we'll be there. So we're certainly not going away anytime soon. But that seems like a nice place to leave it. I think it was important that we clarified that, given there were some comments over the weekend and before that point about it. So everyone now knows, and they've heard it from the horse's mouth. So there we go. Paddy, thank you very much for your time. Thank you all very much for your comments. We had so many there. I couldn't get through all of them, so apologies if I couldn't read them out, but we flashed some up on the screen. Hopefully yours made it. If not, then I'm sure we'll be back for another one of these very, very soon. Hopefully, obviously keep it locked to the Pink 'Un channels, and we'll see you again very, very soon.